The waterproof phone slipped from Theo Lindell's salt-stained fingers, clattering against the concrete floor of the dry dock. He'd been scraping barnacles from the hull of a 40-foot yacht when something had caught his eye. A glint of black plastic wedged beneath the stern, invisible to anyone not lying on their back with a putty knife in hand. Now, staring at the cracked but functional screen, Theo felt his world tilt sideways. The video was still playing, the audio crystal clear despite the phone's obvious tumble into Puget Sound sometime in the past week. His wife, Lorna's voice cut through the morning fog like a serrated blade. "Theo's so damn trusting, it's almost pathetic," she was saying, her laugh sharp and familiar. The camera showed her sprawled across cream-colored leather seating, the kind that only belonged on expensive yachts. "He thinks I'm working late at the leasing office, but after this trip, everything will be mine anyway. The business, the house, everything." The man holding the camera, Gavin Morrison, Theo recognized the voice, chuckled low and appreciative. "And he has no idea?" "None. The prenup has loopholes you could sail a yacht through. His lawyer was garbage, just like his old man's taste in contracts. Once I trigger the separation clause, I'll own 51% of his precious boat shop." Theo's thumb found the pause button, freezing Lorna's satisfied smirk mid-frame. He'd been married to this woman for 8 years. He'd shared his bed, his dreams, his inheritance with her. And she'd been planning his destruction with the precision of a maritime engineer. The phone belonged to someone, probably dropped during a late-night rendezvous on one of the yachts Theo serviced. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, the same night Lorna claimed she was reviewing lease agreements until midnight. Rising from beneath the hull, Theo brushed fiberglass dust from his coveralls and pocketed the phone. The morning rush of the dockyard continued around him. Crane operators moving boats, marine mechanics firing up engines, the familiar symphony of an industry town waking up. None of them knew that Theo Lindell, the quiet boat repairman who kept to himself and did solid work, had just discovered his wife's betrayal in the most mundane way possible. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days fixing hulls breached by negligence or storms, patching holes that threatened to sink vessels worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now he had to figure out how to repair his own life, or whether it was even worth salvaging. Theo walked across the yard toward his office, a converted shipping container that served as the headquarters for Lindell Marine Restoration. The sign his father had painted 20 years ago was fading, but the business was solid. Theo had inherited not just the shop, but a reputation for meticulous work and fair dealing. Yacht owners from Seattle to Vancouver brought their vessels to him because he understood both the technical challenges and the emotional investment people had in their boats. Rita Kowalski was already at her desk when Theo entered, sorting through invoices with the methodical precision she brought to everything. She'd been his father's business partner back when the company was just Lindell Repairs, and she'd stayed on when Theo inherited the operation. Officially, she owned 49% of the company. Unofficially, she'd been in love with Theo since before he married Lorna, though she'd never said as much directly. "You look like someone stole your anchor," Rita said without looking up from her paperwork. She was 39, with graying brown hair and hands that showed the wear of 2 decades working with marine hardware. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Theo poured himself a cup from the ancient percolator that had survived 3 office relocations. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, exactly how his father had made it. "Rita, what do you know about prenuptial agreements?" She glanced up, her expression carefully neutral. "Why? Lorna asking for a renewal?" "Something like that." Theo settled into his desk chair, the phone's weight heavy in his pocket. "If someone wanted to challenge the terms of a prenup, what would they need?" "Depends on the terms. Most prenups have clauses about infidelity, asset mismanagement, stuff like that. Your dad's lawyer who drew up yours, what was his name? Henderson? He was old school. Probably built in protections you don't even remember agreeing to." Theo's coffee went cold as he considered this. His father had insisted on the prenup, not out of distrust for Lorna, but from a lifetime of watching maritime businesses destroyed by messy divorces. The boat industry was full of family operations, torn apart when marriages failed, leaving valuable assets tied up in court for years. Hypothetically, Theo said carefully, if someone violated the terms of a prenup, what would happen to jointly held assets? Rita set down her pen. "Theo, what's going on?" Before he could answer, the office phone rang. Rita answered with their standard greeting, but her expression shifted as she listened to the caller. She covered the mouthpiece and mouthed Gavin Morrison to Theo. Theo's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll take it." "Theo, good morning." Gavin's voice was smooth and confident. the tone of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I've got a situation with the Meridian Dream. She's developed some hull issues, and I need your best work." Money's no object. The Meridian Dream was Gavin's flagship yacht, a 60-foot luxury vessel that he used for his charter business. Theo had serviced it twice before, both times impressed by the craftsmanship and appalled by how carelessly Gavin treated a $1 million investment. "What kind of hull issues?" Theo asked. "Stress fractures along the waterline. Nothing catastrophic yet, but you know how these things spread. I need it seaworthy by Friday. I've got clients flying in from Singapore." Theo found himself agreeing to examine the yacht that afternoon, his mind already working through the implications. The Meridian Dream was where the video had been shot. He was certain of it from the distinctive interior he'd glimpsed in the background. After hanging up, Rita studied him with the intensity she usually reserved for complex repair estimates. "Theo, I've known you since you were 17 years old. I watched you rebuild your first engine. I was there when your dad died. I held your hand through the worst storms this business has seen. So when I ask what's wrong, I'm not asking as your business partner. I'm asking as someone who cares about you." Theo pulled out the phone and showed her the paused video. Rita watched without comment, her expression growing darker as Lorna's words filled the small office. When it ended, she sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "Well," she said finally, "that explains why she's been asking so many questions about the business finances." "She has?" "Last month she called asking about revenue projections, asset valuations, stuff like that. Said it was for insurance purposes, but I thought it was odd." Rita's jaw tightened. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "I don't know, but I'm going to find out." That afternoon, Theo drove to the marina where Gavin kept his fleet. The Morrison Charter Company occupied a prime section of waterfront, with slips for 6 vessels ranging from day-trip boats to luxury yachts. Gavin had built the business from nothing over the past decade, leveraging his charm and connections to attract wealthy clients who wanted to experience the Pacific Northwest in comfort. The Meridian Dream sat at the end of the longest pier, her white hull gleaming despite the stress fractures Gavin had mentioned. They were subtle but serious, hairline cracks that spoke of either impact damage or metal fatigue. Either way, the yacht shouldn't be taking passengers until the repairs were completed. Gavin appeared as Theo was examining the damage, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than most people's car payments. He was 41, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that required significant time and money to achieve. "Worse than I thought?" Gavin asked, crouching beside Theo on the dock. "Could be. I'll need to do some stress tests. Maybe pull a few plates to see how deep the damage goes." Theo kept his voice professional, fighting the urge to confront the man who was sleeping with his wife. "When did you first notice the cracks?" "About a week ago. We'd just returned from a 3-day charter up to the San Juan Islands. Beautiful trip, actually. Smooth seas, perfect weather." Gavin's smile was practiced and meaningless. "Some of my clients like to extend their stays, if you know what I mean." Theo knew exactly what he meant. He also knew that Lorna had claimed to be working late 3 nights last week, the same nights Gavin's yacht had been out on charter. "I'll need to schedule dry dock time," Theo said. "Probably 3 days minimum, depending on what we find." "Whatever it takes. Like I said, money's no object. I just need her seaworthy by Friday." As they walked back toward the marina office, Gavin's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and his expression shifted subtly, the confident mask slipping for just a moment. "Sorry, I need to take this. Business call." He stepped away, but Theo could hear fragments of the conversation. A woman's voice, agitated and demanding. Not Lorna, but someone equally upset about something. When Gavin returned, his smile was strained. "Everything all right?" Theo asked. "Fine. Just client management. You know how it is." But Gavin's eyes were worried, and Theo filed that information away for later consideration. That evening, Theo sat in his truck outside his own house, watching Lorna through the kitchen window. She was making dinner, moving through the familiar routine they'd shared for years. From the outside, they looked like any other middle-aged couple in suburban Seattle. Comfortable, established, content. The house had been his father's, a modest 2-story craftsman in a neighborhood that was slowly gentrifying. When they'd married, Lorna had pushed to sell it and buy something more impressive, but Theo had resisted. Now he understood why she'd been so insistent. She wasn't interested in building a life with him. She was interested in liquidating his assets. His phone buzzed, a text from Lorna. "Working late again? Don't wait up." Theo checked the timestamp, 6:47 p.m. Then he called the yacht leasing office where Lorna claimed to work. The receptionist informed him that Lorna Lindell had left at 5 p.m. sharp, same as always. Instead of going inside, Theo drove back to the marina. The Meridian Dream was dark, but there were lights in the cabin of a smaller yacht 3 slips down. As he watched, 2 figures emerged onto the deck, Lorna and Gavin, both dressed for dinner at an expensive restaurant. Theo followed them at a distance as they walked to Gavin's BMW and drove toward downtown Seattle. They ended up at Canlis, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, where Theo watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as they shared wine and intimate conversation at a corner table. He was about to leave when his phone rang. Rita's number appeared on the screen. "Theo? I'm sorry to bother you, but I've been thinking about what we discussed today. I pulled the original prenup from your father's files, and there's something you need to know." "What is it?" "The asset protection clause is more comprehensive than I remembered. If Lorna can be proven to have engaged in financial misconduct or infidelity, she forfeits any claim to marital assets. But here's the thing. The burden of proof is on you, and it has to be ironclad. Your father made sure of that after what happened to the Kowalski family." Theo remembered the Kowalskis, Rita's cousins who'd lost their fishing operation in a bitter divorce that dragged through the courts for 3 years. "What kind of proof?" "Documentation of financial impropriety, evidence of asset misappropriation, that sort of thing. The prenup specifically mentions business assets being transferred to third parties without the consent of both spouses." A plan began forming in Theo's mind, cold and methodical like everything else he approached. "Rita, who has access to our business banking? Just you and me. Why? I want you to set up a dummy transaction. Make it look like we're selling a major piece of equipment to Morrison Charter Company. Something expensive enough to require both our signatures, but process it with just mine. Theo, that's legal. We own the equipment. We can sell it to whomever we want. But if someone tries to claim they have authority to approve major business transactions on my behalf, we'll have documentation that they're lying." Rita was quiet for a long moment. "This is about more than just catching her cheating, isn't it? She's been planning to destroy me, Rita. I'm just evening the odds." Over the next few days, Theo threw himself into the repair work on the Meridian Dream with an intensity that surprised even him. The stress fractures were worse than they'd initially appeared, requiring him to remove several hull plates and reinforce the underlying structure. It was delicate work that demanded complete focus, which suited his mood perfectly. While he worked, he listened. The marina was a small community, and gossip traveled fast. He learned that Gavin had been struggling financially despite his outward success, that several clients had complained about the condition of his vessels, and that there were rumors of him being investigated by the Coast Guard for safety violations. More importantly, he learned that Lorna had been asking questions about him. The harbor master mentioned that she'd been by the week before, wanting to know about boat valuations and how marine liens worked. She'd claimed to be researching insurance options, but her questions were too specific and too focused on asset seizure procedures. On Wednesday, Theo made his next move. He called Danny Kowalski, Rita's nephew, who'd gone to law school and specialized in maritime and family law. Danny had handled several divorce cases involving boat owners, and he understood both the emotional and financial complexities involved. They met at a coffee shop in Ballard, far enough from the marina to avoid unwanted attention. Danny was 52, with Rita's sharp eyes and their family's instinct for spotting trouble before it arrived. "Rita told me you might need some advice," Danny said after they'd ordered. "She didn't give me details, but she seemed worried." Theo showed him the video from the phone, watching Danny's expression shift from curiosity to professional interest to something approaching admiration. "Well," Danny said when it finished, "that's about as clear-cut as evidence gets. But I'm guessing you want more than just a straightforward divorce proceeding. I want to protect my assets and make sure she can't destroy what my father built. If that means playing by her rules, so be it." Danny pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. "The prenup Rita showed me is solid, but enforcement can be tricky. Washington's a community property state, which means judges tend to favor equal distribution unless there's compelling evidence of misconduct. What you've got here is compelling, but we need to be strategic about how we use it. What do you recommend? Document everything? Financial records, communication logs, witness statements? Build a case that shows she's been systematically planning to defraud you of marital assets. The video is great, but it's just the beginning." They spent an hour going over Theo's options. with Danny explaining the legal mechanisms available for protecting business assets during divorce proceedings. The conversation was technical and dry, but Theo found himself energized by the process. For the first time since discovering Lorna's betrayal, he felt like he had some control over the situation. That evening, Theo implemented the next phase of his plan. He created a fake email account under the name Thomas Lindbergh, claiming to be a potential buyer interested in purchasing marine restoration businesses in the Pacific Northwest. He sent inquiries to several companies, including his own, asking for detailed financial information and asset valuations. When Lorna volunteered to handle the inquiry, claiming that Theo was too busy with repair work to deal with potential buyers, he knew he had her. Over the next few days, he watched as she compiled comprehensive financial records for Thomas Lindbergh, including information she shouldn't have had access to without his permission. She sent bank statements, equipment valuations, and even projections for future earnings. Every email was a documented violation of the prenup's confidentiality clauses. But Theo wasn't finished. He wanted to understand the full scope of her betrayal, and that meant getting closer to Gavin's operation. Using his legitimate business relationship as cover, he began spending more time at the marina, ostensibly to monitor the Meridian Dream's repairs, but actually to observe the daily routines of Morrison Charter Company. What he discovered was more interesting than he'd expected. Gavin's business was in serious trouble, with several boats in poor condition and a client base that was steadily shrinking due to safety concerns and poor service. The company was hemorrhaging money, and Gavin was desperate enough to consider any option that might provide an influx of cash, including apparently marrying a woman who could give him access to a profitable marine business. On Friday morning, Theo received a call that changed everything. It was from Bryce Hoffman, a dockhand who worked part-time for several marina operations, including Morrison Charter. Bryce was in his mid-20s, with the kind of rough edges that came from growing up in the working-class neighborhoods that were being pushed out by Seattle's tech boom. "Mr. Lindell, I need to talk to you about something. It's about your wife and Mr. Morrison." They met at a diner in Georgetown, away from the marina and its network of gossips and informants. Bryce was nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup and glancing around the restaurant as if he expected to be overheard. "I don't usually get involved in other people's business," he began, "but this thing with your wife and Gavin, it's gotten complicated." "How so?" Bryce took a deep breath. "She's pregnant. Told Gavin it's his kid, but that's not possible. The timing doesn't work out." Theo felt the world shift again, the same sensation he'd experienced when he'd first found the phone. "How do you know?" "Because she's been with me too. Started about 6 months ago, always when Gavin was out of town on business. She said you weren't paying attention to her, and she needed someone who appreciated her." The diner suddenly felt too small, too warm. Theo loosened his collar and tried to process this new information. "You're saying the baby is yours?" "Maybe, or maybe it's someone else's. All I know is she's been playing games with a lot of people, and I'm tired of being one of them." Bryce pulled out his own phone and showed Theo a series of text messages from Lorna. They were explicit and manipulative, promising him things she clearly had no intention of delivering. More importantly, they were dated and time-stamped, providing a clear timeline of her affairs. "Why are you telling me this?" Theo asked. "Because Gavin's been talking about expanding his operation, maybe buying out some smaller companies to consolidate the market. He mentioned your shop specifically, said it would be a good fit for his long-term plans." Bryce's expression hardened. "I've worked for guys like Gavin before. They take what they want and don't care who gets hurt in the process." Theo spent the weekend thinking about Bryce's revelation and what it meant for his plans. The pregnancy added a new layer of complexity to an already intricate situation, but it also provided additional leverage. If Lorna was trying to pass off another man's child as Gavin's, while simultaneously planning to divorce Theo and seize his assets, she was playing a game with stakes higher than he'd originally understood. On Monday morning, he called Danny Kowalski again. "I need to know about paternity fraud," Theo said without preamble. "What kind of legal exposure does someone face if they try to claim false paternity for financial gain?" Danny was quiet for a moment. "That's a very specific question, Theo. Are we talking hypothetically here?" "Not even close." After explaining Bryce's revelations, Theo listened as Danny outlined the potential legal consequences of paternity fraud, particularly when it involved attempts to manipulate financial settlements or inherit assets under false pretenses. "The key is documentation," Danny said. If you can prove that she knowingly misrepresented paternity for financial gain, it becomes fraud, plain and simple. Combined with the prenup violations and the evidence of infidelity, you'd have grounds for pursuing criminal charges, not just civil remedies. What would you need to make that case? Medical records, communication logs, witness statements, basically enough evidence to show intent to defraud. It's not enough to prove she had affairs. You have to prove she was deliberately trying to manipulate the paternity situation for financial benefit. Theo hung up and stared out at the dockyard, watching a crew preparing to launch a restored sailboat. The process was methodical and precise. Every line checked, every system tested, every detail confirmed before the vessel touched water. One mistake, one overlooked flaw, and months of work could be destroyed in minutes. His marriage had been like that boat, he realized. He'd been so focused on the day-to-day maintenance that he'd missed the fundamental structural problems that were slowly tearing it apart from the inside. But unlike the boat, his marriage wasn't worth saving. The question now was how much of himself he was willing to sacrifice to ensure that Lorna's betrayal didn't destroy what his father had built. That afternoon, while working on final repairs to the Meridian Dream, Theo made his decision. He called Rita and asked her to meet him at the office after hours. "I need you to help me with something," he said when she arrived. "Something that's going to test every principle we've ever had about honest business practices." Rita settled into her chair and fixed him with the steady gaze that had intimidated suppliers and clients for 2 decades. "What do you need?" "I want to transfer my ownership stake in the company to a shell corporation controlled by Gavin Morrison. On paper, it'll look like I've sold out to him for a fraction of what the business is worth. In reality, the transaction will be reversible through a series of holding companies that I control." "That's incredibly risky, Theo. If something goes wrong, I'll lose everything anyway. At least this way, I have some control over the process." Rita studied him for a long moment. "You're planning to let her think she's won, aren't you? Let her trigger the divorce proceedings, try to claim assets that she thinks Gavin controls. Something like that. And when she realizes what's happened?" Theo's smile was cold and calculated. "By then, it'll be too late." Over the next week, Theo and Rita worked with Danny to create an intricate web of legal entities and financial instruments designed to protect Theo's assets, while giving Lorna enough rope to hang herself. The plan was complex and required precise timing, but it had the advantage of using Lorna's own greed and ambition against her. The Shell Corporation was registered under the name Pacific Marine Holdings, with Gavin listed as the primary shareholder. On paper, it appeared that Theo had sold his majority stake in Lindell Marine Restoration for a below-market price, possibly due to financial distress or poor business judgment. In reality, Pacific Marine Holdings was owned by another company, which was owned by a third entity, which ultimately traced back to Theo through a series of trusts and legal mechanisms that would take a forensic accountant weeks to unravel. The beauty of the scheme was that it relied entirely on legal transactions and documented agreements. Nothing they were doing was fraudulent or deceptive in a legal sense. They were simply taking advantage of the complex corporate structures that wealthy individuals and businesses used every day to protect their assets. While the legal framework was being established, Theo continued his surveillance of Lorna and Gavin. Their relationship had taken on a new urgency since Bryce's revelation about the pregnancy, with both of them clearly aware that time was running out to execute whatever plan they'd developed. Theo watched as they met for increasingly frequent dinners and private conversations, often on board the Meridian Dream, which had become their preferred venue for discussing sensitive matters. The yacht's privacy and mobility made it an ideal location for planning activities they didn't want observed or recorded. But Theo had anticipated this. During his repair work on the vessel, he'd installed a small recording device in the main cabin, disguised as a component of the yacht's entertainment system. The device was voice-activated and transmitted its recordings to a secure server that Danny had helped him establish. The recordings were illuminating. Lorna and Gavin were indeed planning to time their relationship reveal with Theo's financial destruction, hoping to minimize the legal consequences of their affair by ensuring that he'd be too financially devastated to mount an effective legal challenge. More importantly, the recordings captured Lorna's admission that she'd been systematically stealing from the business for months, transferring small amounts to accounts that Gavin controlled, and then using those funds to pay for their shared expenses. "Once the divorce is final," she said on one recording, "we'll have complete control of the marine restoration business and enough capital to expand Morrison Charter into a real operation. Theo won't have the resources to fight us, and by the time he figures out what happened, we'll be untouchable. Gavin's response was equally damning. What about the pregnancy situation? If Bryce starts talking, Bryce won't be a problem. I've got enough dirt on him to keep him quiet, and besides, who's going to believe a dockhand over a successful businesswoman? Theo listened to hours of these recordings, each conversation providing additional evidence of the conspiracy that had been developing under his nose for months. By the time he'd compiled everything, he had enough documentation to support criminal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. But he wasn't ready to play that card yet. He wanted Lorna and Gavin to commit fully to their plan, to take actions that would be impossible to undo or explain away. He wanted them to believe they'd won right up until the moment their world collapsed around them. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On a Thursday morning in late October, Lorna announced that she'd been offered a position with a marine leasing company in San Francisco and that she'd decided to accept it. "It's a fresh start," she said over breakfast, her performance carefully rehearsed. "I think we both know that things haven't been working between us for a while. This job gives us a chance to figure out what we want without the pressure of living in each other's pockets." Theo nodded thoughtfully, playing the role of the supportive but confused husband. "How long would you be gone?" "Indefinitely. The position comes with relocation assistance and a significant salary increase. It's too good an opportunity to pass up." What she didn't say, but what Theo knew from the recordings, was that the job was fictional. Gavin had created a fake offer letter using contacts in the industry, designed to provide cover for Lorna's departure, while making it appear that she was the injured party in their marriage's dissolution. The plan was for her to move to San Francisco, establish residency, and then file for divorce in California, where the community property laws were more favorable to her position. By the time Theo realized what was happening, she'd have legal standing to claim half of his assets, including the business she believed Gavin now controlled. "I think that's a good idea," Theo said, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "We both need some space to think about what we want our future to look like." Lorna's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of regret and uncertainty. "I'll start packing this weekend. The company wants me to start as soon as possible." That evening, Theo called Danny and Rita to a meeting at the office. It was time to implement the final phase of their plan. "She's going to make her move within the next 2 weeks," he told them. "Once she's established residency in California, she'll file for divorce and try to claim assets she thinks are controlled by Gavin. That's when we spring the trap." Rita looked troubled. "Theo, are you sure about this? Once we start this process, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over and a lot of people are going to get hurt." "My marriage was over the moment she decided to betray everything my father built," Theo replied. "I'm just making sure she doesn't profit from her betrayal." Danny spread out a timeline on the conference table, showing the sequence of legal actions they'd need to take once Lorna filed for divorce. "The key is timing. We need to let her commit to her fraudulent claims before we reveal the true ownership structure of the business. If we move too early, she can claim she was misled. If we wait too long, she might figure out what's happening and change tactics." "What about Gavin?" Rita asked. "He's going to realize he's been set up when the asset seizures start." "Let me worry about Gavin," Theo said. "I've got something special planned for him." The next morning, Theo called Gavin and asked to meet at the marina. The Meridian Dream was back in the water, her hull repairs completed and her systems fully functional. She was, Theo had to admit, a beautiful vessel, the kind of yacht that represented everything he'd once dreamed of owning himself. "She looks good as new," Gavin said as they stood on the dock admiring the yacht. "Your work is always top-notch, Theo. I'll make sure to recommend you to anyone who needs serious marine restoration." "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about," Theo said. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding business expansion. I might be interested in exploring some kind of partnership arrangement." Gavin's interest was immediate and obvious. "What kind of partnership?" "Well, I've been having some cash flow issues lately. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make me consider my options. If the right opportunity came along, I might be willing to sell majority control of Lindell Marine to someone who could provide capital for expansion." It was a carefully crafted lie, designed to appeal to Gavin's greed while providing a cover story for the Shell Corporation transaction they'd already completed. By the time Gavin discovered that he didn't actually control Theo's business, it would be too late to matter. "That's very interesting," Gavin said, trying to hide his excitement. What kind of timeline are we talking about? Soon. My wife is moving to California for a new job, and I need to restructure some things to accommodate the change in our financial situation. They spent an hour discussing the fictional partnership, with Theo feeding Gavin carefully selected information about the business's finances and growth potential. By the end of the conversation, Gavin was convinced that he was about to acquire a profitable marine restoration company for a fraction of its market value. I'll have my lawyer draw up some preliminary documents, Gavin said as they prepared to leave. We should move fast on this before other buyers start sniffing around. Agreed, but let's keep this between us for now. I don't want word getting out until everything's finalized. Gavin's handshake was firm and confident, the grip of a man who believed he was about to pull off the deal of his lifetime. Theo matched his grip and his smile, knowing that this would likely be the last friendly conversation they'd ever have. That weekend, Lorna packed her belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd been planning the move for months. She took only personal items and clothes, leaving behind everything that might suggest she was making a permanent departure rather than a temporary career move. "I'll call you when I get settled," she said as she loaded the last suitcase into her car. "We can figure out how to handle the logistics of the separation once I see how the new job works out." Theo kissed her goodbye on their front porch, the same porch where they'd shared their first kiss as newlyweds 8 years earlier. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on him, but he felt no sadness or regret. Those emotions had been burned away by weeks of planning and preparation. "Good luck in San Francisco," he said. "I hope you find what you're looking for." As her car disappeared around the corner, Theo felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in months, he didn't have to pretend to be unaware of his wife's betrayal. He could stop playing the role of the oblivious husband and start being himself again. But first, he had to finish what they'd started. Over the next week, Theo monitored Lorna's activities through a variety of sources. She'd rented an apartment in San Francisco's Marina district, established a California driver's license, and registered to vote in her new state. All of these actions created the legal residency required for her to file for divorce in California rather than Washington. Meanwhile, Gavin had begun the process of acquiring what he believed was majority control of Lindell Marine Restoration. He'd hired a lawyer, arranged for financing, and even started making plans for how he'd integrate the business into his existing operation. Neither of them realized that their actions were being carefully documented by Danny Kowalski and a team of investigators he'd hired to build the legal case against them. The trap was sprung on a Tuesday morning in early November. Lorna filed for divorce in San Francisco Superior Court, claiming irreconcilable differences and seeking half of all marital assets, including Theo's business interests. Her petition was carefully crafted to take advantage of California's community property laws, and it included detailed financial information about Lindell Marine Restoration that she couldn't have obtained legally. More importantly, it claimed that Theo had recently sold his business interests to a third party in an attempt to hide assets from the divorce proceedings. Within hours of the filing, Danny initiated a coordinated legal response that involved multiple jurisdictions and agencies. He filed fraud charges against Lorna in Washington state, documenting her theft of business assets and her attempts to manipulate the divorce proceedings through misrepresentation of the facts. Simultaneously, he filed complaints with the California State Bar against Lorna's attorney, claiming that the lawyer had knowingly filed fraudulent documents based on illegally obtained financial information. But the most devastating blow came when Danny revealed the true ownership structure of Pacific Marine Holdings and its relationship to Lindell Marine Restoration. In a series of legal filings that read like a corporate thriller, he demonstrated that Gavin Morrison had been manipulated into believing he was acquiring assets that were actually controlled by the man he was trying to destroy. The legal documents painted a picture of conspiracy and fraud that stretched back months, with Lorna and Gavin working together to systematically loot Theo's business while planning to claim ownership of it through fraudulent divorce proceedings. Gavin's reaction was swift and predictable. He called Theo within an hour of receiving the legal papers, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "What the hell is going on, Theo? My lawyer is telling me that I don't actually own anything, that this whole deal was some kind of setup." "I'm sorry you're confused," Theo replied calmly, "but I think you should talk to your lawyer about that. I'm sure he can explain the corporate structure to you. Don't play games with me. I know what you did, and I know why you did it, but you have no idea who you're messing with. Actually, I know exactly who I'm messing with. I'm messing with someone who thought he could steal my wife and my business without consequences. How did that work out for you?" The line went dead, but Theo knew it wouldn't be the last he heard from Gavin Morrison. The next few days brought a cascade of revelations and legal actions that made headlines in both Seattle and San Francisco. The story had everything that local media loved: wealthy individuals, fraud, infidelity, and elaborate schemes that read like fiction. Lorna's situation became untenable almost immediately. The job offer that had provided cover for her move to California turned out to be fabricated, leaving her without employment or legal standing to claim California residency. Worse, the evidence of her theft from Lindell Marine was overwhelming, and prosecutors in Washington state were pursuing criminal charges that could result in significant prison time. Her lawyer withdrew from the case after the California State Bar opened an investigation into his conduct, leaving her to navigate the legal system alone while facing charges in 2 states. Gavin's problems were equally severe. The Coast Guard investigation that had been simmering in the background suddenly intensified, with federal agents seizing his business records and impounding several of his vessels for safety violations. The financial pressure of defending against multiple legal challenges while losing his primary source of income quickly drove Morrison Charter Company toward bankruptcy. But Theo wasn't satisfied with simply defeating his enemies in court. He wanted them to understand the full extent of their miscalculation, and he wanted that understanding to be as public and humiliating as possible. The opportunity came when Gavin, desperate and facing financial ruin, agreed to meet Theo for what he claimed was a final attempt at negotiation. They arranged to meet on the Meridian Dream, the yacht where their conflict had begun. Theo arrived early and waited on the dock as evening shadows lengthened across the marina. The recording device he'd installed months earlier was still active, and he'd arranged for several witnesses to be nearby, though not obviously present. Gavin arrived 15 minutes late, his usual polished appearance replaced by the rumpled look of a man under extreme stress. His BMW had been repossessed the previous week, and he'd taken the bus to the marina. "You've destroyed everything," Gavin said without preamble as they boarded the yacht. "My business, my reputation, everything I worked for. I destroyed what you tried to steal," Theo replied. "There's a difference." They sat in the main cabin where Theo had first heard Lorna's voice plotting his destruction. The irony of the location wasn't accidental. Theo wanted this final confrontation to take place in the same space where his enemies had planned his downfall. "What do you want from me?" Gavin asked. "Money? I don't have any left. An apology? Would that make you feel better about what you've done?" "I want you to understand something," Theo said. "I want you to understand that you didn't lose because I was smarter or luckier or more ruthless than you. You lost because you underestimated someone you thought was weak." Gavin's laugh was bitter and exhausted. "Weak? You systematically destroyed 2 people's lives over a marriage that was already over. There's nothing weak about that. My marriage was over the moment my wife decided to betray me, but that didn't give you the right to profit from her betrayal. She came to me, Theo. I didn't seduce her or manipulate her into anything. She was unhappy with her life, and I offered her something different. You offered her the chance to steal what my father built. You offered her the chance to destroy a business that employed 12 people and supported their families. That's not romance, Gavin. That's just greed." The conversation continued for another hour, with Gavin alternating between threats, pleas, and attempts at justification. But Theo remained unmoved. His anger crystallized into something cold and implacable. Finally, Gavin played his last card. "You think you've won, but you haven't thought this through. Lorna is still pregnant, and that baby is going to need support. You're still legally married to her, which means you're legally responsible for any children born during the marriage, regardless of paternity." Theo's smile was sharp and knowing. "Actually, Gavin, I think you should check your facts on that. Lorna isn't pregnant anymore. She had a miscarriage last week, probably brought on by the stress of facing criminal charges. Didn't she tell you?" The color drained from Gavin's face. "That's not possible. I talked to her yesterday." "You talked to someone who's been lying to you for months about everything from paternity to business ownership. Why would you think she'd start telling the truth now?" Gavin stared at him for a long moment, the full scope of his situation finally becoming clear. Not only had he lost his business and his freedom, but the woman he'd sacrificed everything for had been manipulating him just as thoroughly as she'd manipulated Theo. "She played us both," he said quietly. "No," Theo corrected. "She played you. I just decided to play back." As they prepared to leave the yacht, Gavin made one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his life. "What if I testified against her? Told the prosecutors everything I know about her plans, her theft from your business, all of it. Would that make a difference in how this plays out for me? Theo considered the offer. Gavin's testimony would certainly strengthen the case against Lorna, but it wouldn't change the fundamental facts of his own situation. He'd still violated Coast Guard regulations, still participated in a conspiracy to defraud, still made choices that had led to his current predicament. It might, Theo said finally, but that's between you and the prosecutors. I'm not interested in making deals with people who tried to destroy my life. They parted on the dock without shaking hands or exchanging pleasantries. Theo watched as Gavin walked away, his shoulders bent with defeat and the weight of understanding what he'd lost. The criminal trial began in February, with Lorna facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy in Washington state. Gavin had indeed decided to cooperate with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about the plan to manipulate Theo's divorce proceedings and seize control of his business. His testimony was devastating to Lorna's defense, particularly when combined with the recordings from the yacht and the extensive financial documentation that Danny had compiled. The evidence painted a picture of systematic fraud that stretched back almost a year, with Lorna stealing from the business while planning to claim ownership of it through deceptive legal proceedings. Theo attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery and watching as the woman he'd once loved was exposed as a calculating hunter who'd seen their marriage as nothing more than a business opportunity. The most dramatic moment came when Bryce Hoffman testified about his relationship with Lorna and her attempts to manipulate the paternity of her pregnancy for financial gain. His testimony was corroborated by text messages and medical records that showed Lorna had been deliberately misleading multiple men about the father of her child. "She told me the baby was mine," Bryce said from the witness stand, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the situation. "But she was telling Mr. Morrison the same thing, and probably others too. She was just looking for whoever could provide the most financial support." Lorna's defense attorney tried to portray her as a sufferer of an abusive marriage who'd been driven to desperate measures by her husband's controlling behavior. But the evidence contradicted this narrative at every turn, showing instead a woman who'd systematically planned to defraud her husband while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Lorna was sentenced to 4 years in state prison and ordered to pay restitution of $127,000, representing the amount she'd stolen from Lindell Marine Restoration. Gavin received a lighter sentence, 18 months in federal prison for the Coast Guard violations and conspiracy charges, in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors. Morrison Charter Company was liquidated to pay fines and restitution, with the remaining assets distributed among creditors. In the end, both of Theo's enemies were destroyed, their lives and careers ruined by their own greed and miscalculation. But victory came with its own costs. Rita had watched the entire process unfold with growing concern, seeing how the experience had changed Theo from a quiet, methodical craftsman into something harder and more calculating. "You got what you wanted," she said on the day after Lorna's sentencing, as they sat in the office reviewing the business's financial recovery. "But I'm not sure it was worth what it cost you." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've become someone I don't recognize. The Theo I've known for 20 years wouldn't have orchestrated something like this, no matter how badly he'd been betrayed." Theo looked out at the dockyard, where the familiar rhythms of maritime commerce continued unchanged, despite the drama that had consumed his personal life. Maybe the Theo you knew was too naive to survive what Lorna had planned for him. Maybe. Or maybe he was a better man than the one sitting here now. Rita's words stung because they contained an element of truth that Theo had been trying to avoid acknowledging. The process of destroying his enemies had required him to become ruthless and manipulative in ways that went against everything his father had taught him about conducting business with integrity and honor. "I protected what Dad built," he said finally. "That's what mattered." "Your father built more than just a business, Theo. He built a reputation for honesty and fair dealing that took 30 years to establish. In 6 months, you've turned that into something else entirely." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. A young woman in a business suit entered, introducing herself as Sarah Chen from the Pacific Northwest Maritime Business Association. "Mr. Lindell, I'm here to discuss the Morrison Charter assets that are being liquidated. Our association is interested in acquiring some of the vessels for our training programs, and we understand you have experience with their maintenance and repair." What followed was a surreal negotiation in which Theo found himself in a position to acquire at below market prices the same boats that Gavin had used in his charter operation. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was essentially buying back the assets that Gavin had hoped to use to destroy him. Within 6 months of Lorna's conviction, Theo had expanded Lindell Marine Restoration into a full-service marina operation with boat storage, charter services, and marine education programs. The business was more profitable than it had ever been, and his reputation in the industry was stronger than ever, but the success felt hollow. Rita had been right about the cost of his victory. In the process of protecting his father's legacy, he'd compromised the values that had made that legacy worth protecting. The realization came to him on a foggy morning in late summer, as he stood on the dock watching a crew prepare one of the former Morrison charter vessels for a training cruise. The boat was the same model as the Meridian Dream, and seeing it brought back memories of the recordings he'd listened to, the lies he'd uncovered, and the elaborate schemes he'd constructed to bring down his enemies. He'd won, but he'd become someone his father wouldn't have recognized or approved of. The quiet, honest craftsman who'd inherited Lindell Marine Restoration was gone, replaced by someone capable of the kind of calculating ruthlessness that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than waterfront workshops. Rita appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the ritual they'd maintained for years. "Regrets?" she asked, handing him a cup. "Some," he admitted, "but not about the outcome, just about what it required." "You could change that, you know. Go back to being the person you were before all this started." Theo considered her suggestion, but he knew it wasn't that simple. The experiences of the past year had fundamentally altered his understanding of how the world worked and what people were capable of doing to each other. He couldn't unknow what he'd learned about manipulation and betrayal, couldn't return to the naive trust that had made him vulnerable to Lorna's schemes. "I don't think that person exists anymore," he said finally. Rita nodded, though she looked sad. "Then I guess the question is, who do you want to be now?" It was a question that Theo couldn't answer immediately, but it stayed with him as he went about the daily business of running his expanded operation. He found himself thinking about it as he supervised boat repairs, negotiated contracts with clients, and made decisions about the company's future. The answer came to him gradually, through a series of small choices and interactions that slowly rebuilt his sense of purpose. He began mentoring young workers in the marine industry, sharing the technical knowledge and ethical principles his father had taught him. He established scholarship programs for students interested in maritime careers, and he made sure that Lindell Marine's business practices reflected the highest standards of integrity and professionalism. Most importantly, he began the slow process of rebuilding his relationship with Rita, acknowledging the wisdom of her concerns and working to become someone worthy of her respect and affection. The final chapter of the story came on a winter evening 2 years after Lorna's conviction. Theo was working late in the office when he received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Lindell, this is Angela Morrison, Gavin's sister. I wanted to thank you for what you did." Theo was surprised by the call and unsure how to respond. "I'm not sure I understand. My brother was heading down a dangerous path long before he met your wife. The charter business was failing. He was cutting corners on safety, and he was making increasingly desperate decisions to try to keep it afloat. In some ways, what happened was the best thing that could have happened to him." "How so?" "He's clean now, sober for the first time in years, working as a boat mechanic in Oregon and actually taking responsibility for his mistakes. Prison was hard on him, but it also gave him the chance to figure out who he wanted to be when he got out." Angela's words provided an unexpected perspective on the consequences of Theo's actions. He'd been so focused on the satisfaction of defeating his enemies that he hadn't considered the possibility that the experience might ultimately benefit them as well. "I'm glad to hear he's doing well," Theo said, and he was surprised to discover that he meant it. "He asked me to tell you something. He said to tell you that he understands now why you did what you did, and that he doesn't blame you for it. He said he would have done the same thing in your position." After the call ended, Theo sat in his office thinking about the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He'd started as a sufferer of betrayal, become a calculating adversary, and emerged as something more complex, someone who understood both the necessity of protecting what mattered and the cost of the methods required to do so. The business his father had built was stronger than ever, but it was also different. It operated in a world where trust had to be earned and verified, where contracts had to be ironclad, and motivations had to be carefully examined. Theo had learned to navigate that world successfully, but he'd never forgotten the lessons of his experience with Lorna and Gavin. He'd learned that people were capable of elaborate deceptions, that love could be weaponized for financial gain, and that sometimes the only way to protect what you valued was to become ruthless enough to destroy those who threatened it. But he'd also learned that victory without honor was hollow, that relationships built on mutual respect were more valuable than any business asset, and that the measure of a man wasn't just his ability to succeed, but his willingness to help others succeed as well. As he locked up the office and walked across the darkened dockyard toward his truck, Theo reflected on the person he'd become. He was harder than his father had been, more suspicious of others' motivations, and quicker to recognize threats to his interests. But he was also more intentional about his relationships, more generous with his knowledge and resources, and more committed to building something that would outlast his own involvement in it. The fog was rolling in from Puget Sound as Theo drove home, obscuring the familiar landmarks of the waterfront district. But he knew these roads by heart, could navigate them even in the worst weather, because this was his territory now, not just the business his father had left him, but the life he'd built from the wreckage of his marriage and the ashes of his enemies' ambitions. Rita was waiting for him when he arrived at his house. The same house Lorna had wanted to sell, now renovated and expanded into something that reflected his own taste, rather than someone else's dreams of upward mobility. "How was your day?" she asked, a question that had become routine in the 2 years since they'd finally acknowledged what had been obvious to everyone else for decades. "Interesting," he said, and he told her about Angela Morrison's call and the unexpected news about Gavin's transformation. Rita listened without comment, then poured them each a glass of wine from a bottle she'd brought from the restaurant where they'd had dinner. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked. "I think people can become who they need to become," Theo replied. "The question is whether they're willing to pay the price for that transformation." They sat together on the porch, overlooking the water, watching the lights of boats moving through the darkness. It was a peaceful scene, but Theo knew that beneath the surface, the same currents of ambition and betrayal that had nearly destroyed his life were still at work, shaping other people's destinies in ways they might not understand until it was too late. But that was their problem to solve. Theo had learned to protect what mattered to him, and he'd learned to recognize the difference between enemies who deserved destruction and people who simply needed guidance or boundaries. Most importantly, he'd learned that winning wasn't always about defeating your opponents. Sometimes it was about becoming strong enough that they couldn't threaten you in the first place, wise enough to see through their deceptions before they could take root, and successful enough that their schemes seemed petty and desperate by comparison. "No regrets?" Rita asked, echoing their conversation from years earlier. Theo considered the question carefully, thinking about all the choices he'd made and their consequences for everyone involved. "None," he said finally. "I did what I had to do to protect what my father built. Everything else was just collateral damage." Rita smiled and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that spoke of shared understanding and mutual acceptance of who they'd both become. "Good," she said, "because I wouldn't want to be married to someone who had regrets about protecting the people he loves." They sat in comfortable silence as the fog thickened around them, obscuring everything beyond their immediate surroundings, but somehow making the warmth and light of their shared space seem more precious and secure. Theo had started this journey as a sufferer, someone who'd been betrayed and manipulated by people he'd trusted, but he'd ended it as something else entirely, someone who understood the rules of the game well enough to win, but who'd chosen to use that knowledge to build rather than simply to destroy. It wasn't the ending he'd expected when he'd first found that phone beneath the yacht's hull, but it was the ending he'd earned through months of careful planning and ruthless execution. And as he looked out at the water where other people's dreams and schemes were playing out in the darkness, Theo Lindell felt something he hadn't experienced in years: complete and unshakable confidence in his ability to protect what mattered most. In the end, that was enough.